Well, good morning to all.
Good morning.
And thank you, because I believe that this is a moment of grace also for me, meeting the church in this country. Perhaps Professor Conway forgot to say that I am a baptized person. I share the same baptism like you, and so we are all companions in our discipleship of Jesus. And we have all been entrusted with a mission, obviously with different charisms and ministries, but we have one common mission: to speak about, to connect with the world about Jesus. After all, this is the aim of the present Synod. It is about how the Church can really reinforce its synodal dimension, but for a purpose, for a mission. So, I am grateful for this invitation, because it gives me the opportunity, in addition to getting to know you better, but also to stop and reflect with you on the Synod and the possible questions that accompany this process. What are the most recurrent questions in this second phase, in anticipation to the second session of the Ordinary General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops? First of all, how is the second phase of the synodal process proceeding? How will the second session of the Assembly come about? And what results are expected? Because I'm aware that there are a lot of expectations, no? How will the second session be different from the first? What does this intersessional year consist of, and how we are called to live it? I suppose that this is a moment for your church in this intersessional period. Well, stopping to reflect is always a necessary choice when the journey is very long. In order to proceed towards destination, especially when we are crossing unknown territory, or known only on books or maps, one must always take stock of the road traveled, the obstacles encountered, and overcome the growth in knowledge and experience. It is enough to recall the times of the Synod process to realize the richness and complexity of the accumulated experience. It seems like yesterday, believe me, when on the 10th October 2021, Pope Francis opened the synodal process at St. Peter's. And bishops in their local churches, together with Peter, opened this synodal process for the whole church. Because this is the novelty of this process. It is a synod for the whole church, where we are all invited to, or better still, we have the duty to participate. Obviously, there are various stages. Now we arrived at this stage where bishops who carry the burden, to guide their local churches and the church together, collegially. Since then, we have experienced the first phase of the Synod in the particular churches, in every diocese, with the consultation of the people of God. Or better still, with a communal discernment, because it wasn't only a consultation, but a listening to the voice of the Spirit. And it was not easy, and it is not easy to discern among the various voices the voice of the Spirit. Then there were further stages of discernment in the bishops' conferences and also in the continental assemblies. You know that there have been 7 continental synodal assemblies. In our case, this happened in Prague. When I say in our case, for Europe. To claim that never before has the Church experienced such a capillary involvement, that is, all the particular churches, all the people of God living in the churches, all the pastors who are the principle of unity of the people of God entrusted to them, might seem like boasting, no? There are 114 bishop conferences in the world. In the first stage, 112 submitted the report. Never before. I am new to the Secretariat, 3 years ago. So I was curious to see what was the participation in the past, because although this is the first time that there has been this wide consultation, wide discernment. For the Synod on the Family, Pope Francis already introduced a questionnaire, which is something different. So I went to the archives to see what was the response then. Well, and the Church was inviting us to reflect on the family as something that touches each and everyone. Then, not even 80 bishops' conferences did respond. Now, thanks to God, almost 100%. Well, in reality, I feel I am a privileged witness to the great wonders that the Lord is working in the Church through the experience of synodality. This reflection of mine, therefore, has the character of a testimony. Please accept my sharing this morning as a witnessing, with the intention of helping your churches, helping my brothers in the episcopate who lead these churches, not to be afraid to set out on the path of synodality. It is the path of God, which the Spirit is opening for us and along which He is leading us. He is the protagonist of this process, leading us like the people of God in the desert, guided by the cloud. We cannot grasp what we are experiencing today and what the Synod can offer to the Church if we do not remember that we have experienced, and above all, if we do not clarify the reasons, criteria that govern the synodal process. To do this, I turn to the body of texts that the synodal process is producing. It would be a temptation to claim to demonstrate the richness of the synodal process with a sequence of texts. In them, however, one can only grasp the objective testimony of how the Church is living this synodal process. The fact then of fixing the results of a stage in a text makes it possible to verify not only the stages covered, but also the consistency of this journey. On the other hand, one might doubt these documents if they were all written by the same author, in truth. And when I say text, I'm referring to the preparatory document, the document for the continental stage phase, the instrumentum laboris in view of the first session of the assembly, And now what will be the instrumentum laboris for the second session. The diocesan contributions are the fruit of the consultation of the people of God in the particular churches. The national syntheses are the fruit of the discernment of the bishops together, collegially, at the level of the bishops' conferences. From the continental assemblies come the 7 syntheses that enabled the drafting of the first instrumentum laboris. The responses of the particular churches and the bishops' conferences in this intersessional year will provide the material for the drafting of the next instrumentum laboris for the second session of the Synod of Bishops. I mentioned an array of documents. Please take note. These documents do not come from the Roman Curia, from the center. These documents saw their beginning in the local churches. And this is new. Whereas normally we are used now to receive a document published by the dicastery congregation. No. These are documents, drafted by our office, but based on the submissions, the discernment carried out by the people of God under the guidance of their local bishop. This is fundamental. The result of the discernment of the bishops together. Just to give you an example, when we were in Prague, we spent some days. It was an ecclesial assembly, no? When I say ecclesial, I mean bishops, clergy, religious, and laity. But then the last 2 days were reserved for the bishops. And the bishops practically accepted entirely the workings of the ecclesial assembly. I'm saying this to stress that the role, the ministry of the bishop in the church. Because this is the Catholic synodal way of synodality. In the Christian world, there are various forms of synodality, which are good, but there is the particular Catholic way of synodality. So, this body of documents, first of all, allows us to measure what and how much experience of synodality we have gained in the first phases of this process. And to me, this is already the fruit of the Synod. The fact that all the churches and everyone in the church were called into play urged us to question ourselves on the meaning of this process, which for the first time translated into action the normative framework indicated by a constitution of Pope Francis, Episcopalis Communio, the legal framework that leads us on the way for a synodal church. But it also helps us to understand how the synodal process is founded on a very, very important principle, the principle of restitution, which activates a process of continuous circularity. How I would like to see this principle of circularity put into practice on a parish level, on a diocesan level. So, the preparatory document activated the consultation of the people of God in the particular churches, formulated in the diocesan contributions and the synthesis of the bishops' conferences and the corresponding structures of Eastern churches. So, started from below. On the basis of those syntheses, our office drew up the document for the continental phase. on which the 7 continental assemblies worked. Then they sent the reports, which formed the basis of the instrumentum laboris for the Bishops' Synod. The synthesis report of the first session, that is the results of the first session of the Synodal Assembly of Bishops last October, was returned to the local churches, was sent back to you. And on the basis of the contributions that, allow me to say, you will submit to the bishops' conferences, our office then will draft the instrumentum laboris for the second session. You see how the principle of circularity works? So something that started from below reached the center, but sent back. We have spoken of, some have spoken of unnecessary complication. Non sum multiplicanda entia, no? True, if one thinks of a pyramidal church, where everything is regulated according to the principle of authority, only the top of the pyramid was responsible for issuing norms, dispositions, documents, which all were bound to execute by reason of obedience. Second Vatican II gave us back the Ecclesia de Trinitate, recovering the presence and the action of the Holy Spirit who guides the whole church, not only few. It reaffirmed the active capacity of the holy people of God, without denying the functions of the pastors, but rethinking them in a logic of service. It emphasized how the church is a body of churches, in which and from which there is the one and only Catholic Church. So, in a nutshell, the question is ecclesiological. In other words, with what idea of church, of ministry, are we interpreting and living the synodal process? Stating that the synodal church is a church of listening, and specifying that it is a reciprocal listening in which each has something to learn. Faithful people, College of Bishops, and also the Bishop of Rome. One listening to the others, and all listening to the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth. These are not my words. I'm quoting Pope Francis in a famous speech he delivered on the 50th anniversary of the Synod, 2014. The Synod process is offering itself as a privileged way of receiving Second Vatican II. This is one of the fixed points that guide our Secretariat in the service to the Church and to the Pope. There is no shortage of those who claim that these are cosmetic statements. In reality, the verticalist and centralizing logic that has been in force in the Church of Rome for centuries had not changed. The much vaunted decentralization would even be a pretext to affirm the asymmetrical relationship that mortifies particular churches. The Synod's top-down dynamic would be demonstrated by the fact that the indications on how the synodal process should unfold were dictated by the General Secretariat in the preparative document. Those who support this thesis do not understand do not understand the synodal dynamic, which is founded on two principles that are in balance only on the condition of continuous circularity, diversity and unity. Unity is not uniformity. Diversity is not division. This is the richness of the church. The church is no less one if it is conceived as a communio ecclesiarum, a communion of churches, provided that the churches, by unilaterally affirming their diversity, do not end up denying the unity of the whole church. Because of this dynamic, it is to the Bishop of Rome a perpetual, visible principle foundation of the unity both of the bishops and the multitude of the faithful, teaching of Vatican II, hence of all the churches, that he can call the church to a synodal action and initiate a synodal process, just as it is to him to initiate, accompany, conclude an ecumenical council. The preparatory document is nothing but the working tool that accompanied the decision of the successor of Peter to convene for the good of the church an ordinary general assembly on the theme of synodality, for a synodal church, communion, participation, and mission. But once this process was started, the process always sees, and allow me to use the term, a precedence of the local churches over the universal church. The synodal process can only take place starting from local churches, because this is where the people of God lives and walks. I remember that at the early stages of this synodal process, I received a letter from a particular bishop. And he said, alas, now the local churches are not considered as a feud of Rome, but recognized as subjects. The speech at the 50th Synod, which the Pope still considers as the Magna Carta of a synodal church, states that the first level of the exercise of synodality takes place in local, particular churches. And Episcopalis Communio emphasizes that the first phase of the Synod has as its purpose the consultation of the people of God on the topic of the assembly of the Synod. If we start from here, it is clear that the documents drafted by our Secretariat are always the result of listening to what happened in the previous stage. Thus, the document for the continental phase was the first fruit of listening to the synthesis of the bishops' conferences, which were in turn drafted on the basis of listening to the diocesan contributions. The instrumentum laboris for the first session was the fruit of listening to the reports received from the continental assemblies. And the instrumentum laboris for the second session will also be the fruit of listening to what our Secretariat receives from the particular churches. You see, in this way, the principle of restitution is truly respected. All this has been made possible by the principle of mutual interiority, translated into the dynamic of restitution, which consists in rendering to the holy people of God the fruit of a discernment that develops stage by stage. This principle does not only apply to the current synodal process. The current synodal experience is showing that this is and must be the way to proceed in the church at every level, which is always valid and at all levels of ecclesial life. In the local churches, in groupings of churches, and at the level of the universal church. On closer inspection, a very well-established way of proceeding is reversed here. If the Spirit guides the church, its path, its choices cannot depend solely on the authority of some invested with a function. Rather, those who carry out this service, and I'm referring to the Pope, to the College of Bishops, at the level of Universal Church, and each bishop with his presbyterian, all must make themselves promoters of that listening, synodal listening, that really allows the church to recognize the voice of the Spirit and support the people of God in walking together. To speak of a pastor's duty to promote synodal listening in his church may sound excessive to some. Certainly, it is not a duty established by canon law, but a moral obligation which comes before a canonical obligation, deriving from the fact that the church is constitutively synodal. If you do not like this either, because you consider synodality to be a fashion of the moment, then it is enough to recall the work of the Holy Spirit in the church. The Spirit dwells in the church and in the hearts of the faithful as in a temple. Paul to the Corinthians. But do we believe this? Lumen Gentium reminds us also of this. And in them he prays and bears witness to their condition as children of God by adoption. He introduces the church into the fullness of truth, unifies it in communion and ministry, provides and directs it with various hierarchical charismatic gifts, beautifies it with its fruit. By the power of the gospel, he makes her rejuvenate, continually renews her and leads her to perfect union with her bridegroom. Lumen Gentium. The rediscovery of an ecclesial pneumatology, as our brothers from the Christian East expresses it. The rediscovery of an ecclesial pneumatology determines that listening comes first in the life of the church. This is not a new statement, because faith, and therefore the church, is born from listening. Listening to the Word of God, listening to the Spirit. The novelty lies in the fact that the principle of listening is applied to decision-making processes and involves all ecclesial subjects, the holy people of God, the College of Bishops, and the Bishop of Rome, in close relationship with each other. In the pyramid model of the church, listening went from top to the bottom, in a chain of transmission that went from God down to the church through the successor of Peter. In the synodal process, everyone is a participant, each obviously according to his and her function. Many regret that model and repeat it insistently. The discussions around Francis' pontificate, and no less than those around Benedict's, mirror this nostalgia. Such a conception does not like synodality, just as the council did not like collegiality, deeming the involvement of the people of God unnecessary and harmful, as well as the participation of the bishops in the solicitude for the whole church, the exclusive prerogative of the Supreme Pontiff. In this vision, there is no place even for the exercise of synodality instituted by Paul VI. The reception of the council is instead showing that synodality, collegiality, and primacy are together the fruit of circularity. How many times does the term circularity come back to mind? But it really is a hallmark of conciliar ecclesiology that does not tolerate the exclusion of someone in favor of someone, or the affirmation of someone to the detriment of someone else. The synodal process is fully realized when all the subjects, the holy people of God, the College of Bishops, and the bishops of Rome, each with their own function, act in synergy with the others for the building of the church. And this is the synodal church. The synodal process is clearly showing us how the dynamism is taking shape. I have already emphasized that it is up to the Bishop of Rome to convene, accompany, and close the synod. Then one understands the church as constitutively synodal. One will not struggle to recognize this responsibility of calling the church for a synodal action as one of the most characteristic aspects of the Petrine ministry. From the moment of its convocation, according to the phases of the synodal process, the whole church is involved and acts. The whole people of God in the particular churches, all the bishops, as a principle of unity in their churches. The bishops, together with the bishop in the bishops' conferences and in the continental assemblies, and then in the properly assembly phase that is being celebrated in Rome, the Synod of Bishops. Truly, we have been able to experience how it is possible that the Synod of Bishops, representing the Catholic episcopate, becomes an expression of episcopal collegiality within the entirely synodal church. I see in this a promotion of both the people of God and the episcopal ministry. Of the people of God, first of all, because consultation in the particular churches takes place by virtue of the recognition that the totality of the baptized participate in the prophetic function of Christ as the subject of sensus fidei. But the listening of the people of God was possible by virtue of the bishop, who in his church has called the consultation and gathered the contributions and introduced at the level of the grouping of churches in the logic of the exchange of gifts. On the other hand, the synthesis produced by the bishops' conferences was not a notarial act, but a real discernment, which can be read as a true act of collegiality. Never before there has been this experience. I am convinced that along this path we will be able to find the mature the capacity to exercise collegiality. Always cum Petro et sub Petro, that the council has handed over to us. In a synodal church, the promotion of the proper function of the people of God does not repress episcopal ministry, but exalts episcopal ministry. Its necessity, its usefulness, its fruitfulness. It is starting from the relationship between the holy people of God and its pastors that it is possible to see how the church is a sacrament of unity, that is, a holy people gathered, ordered under the guidance of the bishops. In the synodal process, the principle that Vatican Council lays at the foundation of the church itself is made manifest. I quote, "The common priesthood and the ministerial priesthood are ordered to each other because both share in the one priesthood of Christ." This principle rests on the close relationship between the two forms of participation in Christ's priesthood, which consist in bringing the respective relationship between the assembly and the minister acting in persona Christi, the bishop. It is clear, although not always recalled, in the prophetic sphere, where the relationship between the sensus fidei and the teaching of the church, the magisterium, has been evident in the past with the definition of the Marian dogmas. This is less clear with reference to the royal function within which ecclesial discernment falls. Here, the resistance of recognizing the participation of all is stronger because it demands a rethinking of the entire subject of decision-making processes in the church. This is a very delicate aspect, where it does not seem sufficient to affirm the principle and recall doctrine. Paradoxically, it is easier in the church to recognize the relevance of the sensus fidei in the definition of a dogma than in decision-making processes. The issue had already been raised by Henry Newman way back 1857, who was astonished that the laity were forbidden to intervene in theological matters when the Pope himself had initiated a consultation to ascertain the position of the bishops and their faithful on the definability of the Immaculate Conception. Perhaps we should question ourselves as to the reasons for reserving the sphere of decisions to the hierarchy alone, as if this were the specific of episcopal ministry. Of course, it is not always easy to govern decision-making processes, and we are still novices. We are still learning in the art of synodality. It seems to me, however, that the time is ripe for us to learn to accept that the secret of ecclesial discernment lies in this circularity between the prophetic function of the people of God, and here I mean from the bishops down to the last lay faithful, because at times when we say people of God, we think that we are only referring to the laity. We are all members of the people of God. So, I repeat, the secret of ecclesial discernment lies in this circularity between the prophetic function of the people of God and the guiding function of the pastors. The maturing of an ecclesial conscience marked by synodality, which knows how to balance the participation of all and the exercise of authority in the church at all levels of its life, would be the greatest, most beautiful fruit of this particular synod. A month ago, our office published a document, 5 Perspectives for Theological Exploration in view of the next session of the Bishops' Assembly. In the introduction of this document, there's a paragraph. I would like to share it with you. The focus of the next assembly will therefore be the theme of everyone's participation with our varied vocations, charisms, and ministries in the one mission of proclaiming Jesus Christ to the world. In light of the church missionary transformation envisaged by the apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, according to which the new evangelization must imply new protagonism of each of the baptized, we will reflect on the contribution to the mission that comes from the recognizing and promoting the specific gifts of each member of the people of God and the relationship between the common work and the ministry of authority of the pastors. The dynamic connection between the participation of all and the authority of some in the horizon of communion and mission will be deepened in its theological meaning, in its practical ways of setting it in motion, and in the reality of canonical structures. This confirms what I have been sharing with you. So, and I try to conclude. If we apply what we have been saying to the present moment, we can easily understand the importance of this year of transition and the tasks we have been handed. The first and most important urgency is that we learn to be synodal. Before being an ecclesial practice, synodality is an inner disposition. Before we change structures, we need to change. We can use the language of synodality, and yet we can be authoritarian. There are people who are excellent to speak about synodality, but they are not synodal. It is difficult to mature a synodal style, a synodal form of the church, if its most qualified interpreters do not espouse this mentality and promote its style. For this reason, in the document of our Secretariat that accompanied the return of the synthesis report to the local churches, we insisted on the need to keep synodal dynamism alive, stressing that preserving and reviving the synodal dynamic that has involved the entire people of God over the past 2 years is just as important as the work of in-depth study and consultation outlined above. Doing this, fostering the participation of all, activating initiatives capable of involving the entire people of God, formative activities like this one this morning, in-depth theological studies, celebrations in synodal style, grassroots consultation, listening to minority populations and groups living in conditions of poverty, social marginality. Well, promoting participatory bodies will be the privileged way to grow in a synodal church. The testimonies on the work done and the experiences lived, especially if they pass on good practices, will be a great help to the whole church, again, in the logic of exchanging gifts. On the other hand, this exercise of synodality will be easily activated if the guiding question that is leading us to the second session of the Bishops' Synod Assembly, how to be a synodal church in a mission, will be deepened as requested at 2 levels. At the level of local churches, how can the differentiated co-responsibility in the mission of all the members of the people of God be enhanced. What models of relationship, structures, processes of discernment, decision-making with regard to the mission enable it to be recognized, shaped, and promoted? What ministries, participating bodies can be renewed or introduced to better express this co-responsibility? Number 2, the level of relations between churches, between groupings of churches at a different level and with the Bishop of Rome. How to creatively articulate these relations in order to find a dynamic balance between the dimension of the church as a whole and its local roots. We are all participating, again, not to repeat the consultation already done in the first phase, but to deepen the synthesis report as the fruit of the consensus expressed by the Assembly during the first session. Here too, it is a matter of measuring, not in statistical terms, but in terms of ecclesial discernment, whether the consensus expressed by the Assembly last October is effectively reflected in the ecclesial body. This can only happen if the local churches and the bodies at the level of groupings of churches receive and return the synthesis report in the spirit. The instrumentum laboris for the second session will depend on the synthesis that will reach our office by next May. And that will focus on the fundamental question, how to be a synodal church in a mission. These, broadly speaking, are the steps we are called to take in this year. The fruits of this commitment will be seen in the instrumentum laboris for the second session of the Assembly. I refer to that text to grasp the challenge at this stage of the synodal process, in which the main subjects of the journey are each and every local church, emphasizing the tasks incumbent on each diocesan bishop and on the bishops' conferences, which are called to play a coordinating role at the level of grouping of churches, can be experienced as an overload of commitments compared to the ordinary administration, or as the way through which the synodal form of the church and the corresponding synodal exercise of the episcopal ministry develops. It depends. In the light of this intermediate step involving the whole church, one can also understand the importance of the next session of the Bishops' Synod. October 24 will constitute the point of arrival of the entire synodal process conducted so far. The moment of final synthesis can be offered to the Church as the outcome of the discernment carried out through the stages experienced at the various levels of the Church life. That synthesis will also be the expression of how and how much the Church will have been able to rethink itself according to a synodal form. Many wonder how the second session will differ from the first and fear that it will be a repeat of what was already said in October 23. Preventing this risk is precisely the principle of restitution. What will emerge from the local churches and the bishop conferences will constitute the heritage of experiences, ideas that will enter into the new instrumentum laboris to answer a guiding question: how to be a synodal church in a mission. There was no shortage of objection to this choice. How can this single question constitute an adequate synthesis of the wealth of themes that emerged in the synodal process and were contained in the Instrumentum Laboris and in the synthesis report. But herein lies the difference, my brothers and sisters. It is not a question of repeating what has already been said. The synthesis report is in fact an expression of the consensus reached in the assembly. Well, there was no shortage of those who criticized the first session of the assembly, describing it as insignificant because no appreciable results were achieved in the reform of the church. In reality, the opposite is the truth. The real result, which is the basis of continuing along the path, is precisely this consensus, because it confirms the church in the direction in which to proceed. The fact that the vote of the assembly confirmed what the Instrumentum Laboris had offered as the fruit of the first phase of listening is not a weakness. If consensus is truly the fruit of listening to the Spirit, where consensus is lacking as the fruit of ecclesial discernment, one must have the patience and the courage to wait. In the church, it is not important to decide at all costs, but to decide according to truth, to obey to the Spirit. One must learn to wait when the certainty of the path has not matured. Walk when consensus is reached. On some issues, the consensus was so evident that the Holy Father decided to entrust in-depth study to certain commissions. These are issues that do not enter directly into the central question expressed by the guiding question, how the church can become more synodal. And that will never enter into contradiction with the synodal process, because the commissions are asked to study a proposal in a properly synodal key. On the other hand, on those 10 topics entrusted to the interdicasterial commissions, the assembly would not go beyond the consensus expressed. The point of arrival of an assembly is not to provide a solution, but to formulate the framework and coordinates within which to seek the solution. This is how it was for the Council, and this is how it is for the synodal process, which called for the rethinking of those issues in a synodal key. To ask a commission of experts to draw up a proposal is not to leave the synodal process, but to give it substance to the actual formulation of a solution that configures those issues in a synodal sense. In this way, moreover, the second session is lightened and can concentrate on a guiding question. If one wants to understand what is required of the second session, one can take up the title assigned by the Holy Father to the Synodal Assembly for a synodal church, communion, participation, and mission. Up to this point, the synod process has dealt with everything that fell within this horizon, showing how the three macro themes, communion, participation, and mission, could be declined in a synodal perspective. What has emerged from the ecclesial discernment is that there is such a close unity between communion and mission, that this link, which is decisive for understanding the synodal form of the church, needs to be further deepened. Hence the question, how to be a synodal church in a mission, which has its test in participation. A church that does not know how to guarantee the right relationship between the participation of all and the authority of the pastors can neither be synodal and not even missionary. I conclude. We also asked the experts to help in exploring these thematic issues. The Assembly, at the conclusion of the first session, expressly requested this input. For this reason, our office set up 5 value groups that would apply themselves with speed and competence to the most decisive questions to answer the guiding question: the synodal missionary phase of the local church, the synodal missionary phase of the groupings of churches, the synodal missionary phase of the universal church and the Petrine ministry. In the form accompanying the establishment of these groups, we say that the results of the theological study carried out by the 5 working groups will be included in the materials that will form the basis of the instrumentum laboris for the second session, and may also serve as an instrument for the preparation of the members for next assembly. This creates a synergy between different actors in the church: the local churches, bishops' conferences, who will offer the contribution of their consultation, and the experts in the various disciplines who will offer their expertise, from which only abundant fruits can come from the ecclesial discernment expected for the second session. So, my brothers and sisters, let us invoke the Spirit in this Easter season to grant us the docility to listen and the courage to walk under His guidance, growing into a model of church more capable, more willing to walk together towards the kingdom of God. Thank you.